couple of thoughts about part-time and summer work when I was growing up in Wayne. My first job was mowing lawns, actually mowing my family's lawn. I was taking piano lessons down at the Music Manor on Main Street in Patterson, which was owned back then by two families in Packanack Lake, I believe, the Irbies and the Freemans. And while I was down there on their counter, they had a little transistor radio, something called a Real Tone, an AM transistor radio, and I wanted that thing. And the deal was that if I mowed the lawn all summer, I could get it. Radio was $29, which was a lot of money back then. So I worked hard and I got it. A year later, I took that radio with me when I got another job. I was delivering the Newark News, and I did that for 4 years. I got a lot of stories about being a paper boy. So I was mowing the lawn at home. My uncle, who lived next door, he was mowing the lawn for Mr. Wheaton across the street. Mr. Wheaton was different than the rest of us. The rest of us in the community worked in the community or surrounding area, and mostly blue collar. Mr. Wheaton was an executive. He worked at United States Trust, downtown Manhattan in the Wall Street district, and he had an accent that was different than the rest of us. It was a Westchester accent, they called it. And he would say things like, you know, it's difficult to find people who want to work downtown anymore with all these suburban banks out there. Well, my uncle didn't want to do the lawn anymore, so Mr. Wheaton asked me if I could come over and mow the lawn, and I started doing that. And I was doing his yard, and he was always trying to have a green lawn. One thing he couldn't stand were dandelions. And the rest of us had dandelions all over the place. We thought it was free flowers. You know, you get them a couple times a year and yellows up the yard, but he'd come over and say, you know, you people, all your dandelion seeds blow over into my yard and I have to deal with it. And that was true. He did. And the way he did, he had this wheelbarrow and this giant carving knife. And on Saturdays, he'd be out in the yard on his knees, and he'd take that carving knife and go out and dig out that dandelion weed and put it in his wheelbarrow. And that went on Saturday after Saturday for years. If he only had the herbicides that we have today, he would have, you know, given anything for turf builder or something like that. So I was doing his yard, and while I'm doing his yard, and I should say that my family was known as doing work for other people, domestic people. My mother and my grandmother cleaned houses from the Depression era forward, and my mother was actually cleaning the house for Mr. and Mrs. Wheaton. And another neighbor, the Johnsons, who lived up on Mountain Road not far from our house, my grandmother worked there for Mrs. Johnson, and they owned Johnson's Driving Range, which was down on Route 23 in Cedar Grove. Went over and Mrs. Johnson asked me if I could mow their yard, and I picked that one up. So now I got 3 lawns that I'm mowing, and I go over there, and that was a nice lawn. I really enjoyed that. It was shady, shade trees all over the place, easy to mow. You never got overheated there, and I'm mowing that yard. My mother was cleaning another house. She was cleaning a house in Wedgwood for the Stantons, and they needed somebody to mow their yard, so I picked that one up. And the Stantons' neighbor, the Bograds, they needed somebody to mow their yard, so I picked that one up. And after I picked that up, and I'm doing the newspaper at the same time, I get a call from my uncle who lives down in Mountain View, and he had a medical procedure, and he couldn't mow his yard. He lived down on Booton Road, not far from the hotel. I went down and mowing that yard. So I'm doing all kinds of stuff like that. And as I got into college, I kept mowing the lawns and picked up another job with my cousin who had a floor waxing business, janitorial service. Back then, we had a lot of houses and businesses that had tile floors, you know, the kind that probably had asbestos in them. And they needed attention. You don't have to do this stuff anymore with the type of floor laminates that are out there. But we had to do it back then, and I learned how to run a buffer. You have to know how to run a buffer. If you don't know how to run a buffer, it will run you. Simple as that. And I learned how to do that, and I got pretty good at it. In fact, learning how to run a buffer saved myself from a lot of twinky details when I got in the Army, because I could do the floors and nobody else knew how to do it. And I would go around. My cousin had a VW microbus. They had all the waxers and buffers and pails and everything else in that. And we would go out and do jobs all over the place. It did Dr. Pascarella. He had a doctor's office on Totowa Road down in Patterson. Stanton's Drugs in Little Falls did that. Dixon's Pharmacy in Mountain View. We did the Community Number 1 Firehouse Rec Center. And that was a big job. I mean, that was a gigantic building, and that floor needed attention because every Friday night they had bingo. So I would go down there with my father and my cousin, and all 3 of us would do that. Bingo was a big deal back then. The volunteer fire department used to have a fair every August, and they raised money that way, but that was always a questionable thing because if you had a rainy week when the fair took place, you didn't make a lot of money. Whereas if you did the bingo every Friday night all year long, you made a lot more money. And they did that. They had a big sign up, bingo every Friday night, $1,000. And people showed up in droves to go to that thing. Another place that I did was interesting was Nagel's Candy Barn. You have a lot of memories about Nagel's if you grew up in Wayne. The aroma would just put calories on your body just walking in there. Did Nagel's. My memory of Nagel's is different. They had wood floors, and I'd go in there and use a wood floor wax. And what I remember is not the smell of chocolate, but the smell of chocolate and the floor wax, which didn't induce you to try to take samples. It was as simple as that. That took your appetite away real quick. And then there was another one that we did. My father and I had this job. On Sunday mornings, we do it right after breakfast. And it was two jobs that were the opposite. Marie's Mountain View Inn, I would describe as a dive. One New Year's Day, my father and I drove by that place, January 1. It was bitter cold. If it was warm out, it was 10 degrees. And we go by the Mountain View Inn and take a look, and here's two guys outside in their jeans and T-shirts having a fist fight. What a way to start a new year. Get your face rearranged. Yes, I have a lot of memories of places like that and reasons for why I never really ever wanted to go into any one of those bars. Long, narrow, dark bar. If they had 30-watt orange bulbs in there, it was a lot. Had one big window in the back that they painted the daily special on, and we'd go in there and clean that. The first thing you did was take hot water and a mop, and you'd mop up the floor and loosen up everything that was barfed, spit, spilled, embedded in there, and the smell that came back from that place really, well, let's say your breakfast that you just had was trying to tell you it wanted to come back up. That's the kind of smell that was in there. And I'd be in there really dark. They had a little Irish or Scottish janitor, and he'd be there watching me, and he'd say, "Hey, laddie, you missed a spot. You missed a spot." And I'm going, "Huh? Where?" And he'd point down at this dark tile, and he's, right there, see it? I didn't see anything. But I get the mop, and I go in there, now you got it. And I'd be cleaning that, mopping it up, and moving on to buff it out. And one Sunday we're in there, and we're cleaning things up. Everything was all finished. The mops and the brooms and the buffers were all in the door. The front door's open. The bartenders come in, and he's cleaning up and getting ready for the afternoon mob. He looked like a character that you'd find in Mad Magazine. That's the kind of a guy he was. And I'm putting the chairs back down and getting ready to leave, and I look up, and here's the door open, and I see a guy in his pajamas and a robe and slippers, and he's stepping over all the stuff to get in the bar. I couldn't believe it. This guy's an alcoholic. I never saw anybody like that. And the bartender's over there, and he's looking, and he's not the friendly guy you see in the TV commercials. He bellows out, "Get out of here! We're closed!" The alcoholic ducks. I guess he figures a mug's coming at him, turns around, sheepishly walks out, and we get out, and we leave, and go across the river to just the opposite place to clean. We did Wolfson's Supermarket. Brightly lit, light floors, easy to do. I'd go in there, and lay down some wax, and buff it and sweep, and it was done. That was just the opposite. And one other memory I have from waxing floors had to do with a house that me and another guy that my cousin hired named John, and we were either in Packanack Lake or off of Black Oak Ridge Road somewhere. Brand new house. John was downstairs in the rec center, which had tile floors on it. I'm doing the kitchen. One of the problems I had over the years of floor waxing, was not buffing, it was sweeping after we cleaned up, because the steel wool pads that we used on the buffers would leave filings of steel wool all over the place. And I, for some reason, couldn't get it out of the corners and stuff. And this time I thought, I'm going to really sweep this kitchen out. It's going to be perfect. It's going to be the best job that's ever been done in any place. And so I'm in there, and I'm doing the floor and sweeping, and I'm sweeping, and I get it all done, and John comes in, and the lady of the house is there, the housewife, and she's got an issue with something. This is back when you had single-income families. John calls me over, and he says, "Hey, you missed a spot." And I thought, how could I possibly have missed a spot? Well, it was one I hadn't thought about. You see, the lady wasn't the cleanest person in the kitchen, and she had made some kind of a pasta dish, and the tomato sauce had spilled out over the side of the stove and down onto the floor, and it was dried up on the floor in this little crevice between the stove and a wall, and had a little piece of lettuce embedded in it to cap it off. And he says, "You missed the spot." And I look down, and the lady looks at me, and I look at her, and I come out with something that you think Jeremy in the comic strip Zitz would say. I mean, still 19 years old, still wet behind the ears, not knowing when to keep my mouth shut. And I look up at both of them, and I say, "Well, I didn't put it there." And a lady gets a little blown up about that. And John says, "Just go out and get a scraper out of the truck." And I went out and cleaned it up, and we moved on from there and made everybody happy. I had forgotten, or maybe never even heard of, the customer is always right at that time. After that, in my junior year going into my senior year, I wound up driving a lumber truck at Van Ness Lumber. That was an interesting summer, and it paid a lot. And as I graduated from college, I got another job that was more fun, didn't pay as much, but I was a morning DJ in Franklin. And I kept that job as a second career as I went through life. That was followed by my first real-time, full-time job, and that was to teach electronics at Whippany Park High School. And there's a whole bunch of other stories related to being in the classroom. Some thoughts about growing up and jobs I had in Wayne,